This is Judaism Unbound, episode 446, Father, Mother, God. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And our conversation today jumps off from a webcomic called Father, Mother, God that one of our guests, Steinberg, is creating. I say is creating because the comic's not yet finished. As of today, you can see the first 6 episodes, which is about halfway through the story, at the link in the show notes to this episode. Jumping off from the webcomic, we're going to be exploring a web of connected ideas and experiences, including between Steinberg and our second guest today, Sue Reinhold. Before we dive in, a quick reminder that we have 5, count them, classes that are about to begin in the Unyeshiva, Judaism Unbound's digital center for Jewish learning and unlearning. One class is a semester-long intro to Judaism entitled Judaism Inbound, taught by our executive director and frequent co-host now, Miriam Turlinchamp. And we also have 4 short mini-courses, all taught by past guests on the podcast, all of which connect in one way or another to the themes of the high holidays, which are coming up real soon. The first class is Tzemach Yorez's class called When Abraham Killed Isaac, The Binding of Isaac Unbound. Second, we have Wendy Bernstein-Lash teaching a class called Elul, Your On-Ramp to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Third up is Hasidism and Neo-Hasidism, Past, Present, and Future with Daniel Kraft. And finally, a class called Kol Nidre, Jewish Vows Literally Unbound, with a fellow you might know. He calls himself Lex Rofberg. There's financial aid available for all of these classes, as we don't want finances to stand in the way of your learning, so just head to judaismunbound.com/classes to learn more and to register. And now for today's conversation. Our conversation jumps off from an incredible new piece of Jewish art entitled Father, Mother, God. It's a digital graphic novel meant to be read on your phone. The comic was developed with the support of the Jewish Writers Initiative's Digital Storytellers Lab. And in the comic, Steinberg grapples with family legacies of addiction, trauma, and mental illness, seeking healing and reclamation amidst her lost Jewish roots. Again, you can find the link to the webcomic in the show notes for today's episode, and you really should read this. Now, Play's journey involves our second guest, Sue Reinhold, who, among other things, leads Torah of Recovery, a lively Torah study group now in its 3rd year that's built to enhance people's recovery from addiction and to help people create distance from addictive tendencies in their lives. Now, a few more words of introduction for our guests. When she isn't making autobiographical webcomics, Play Steinberg is a visual facilitator and scribe, working at the intersection of strategy and spirit with a passion for transformation and making the invisible visible. They actually did this visual scribing work at a conference we put together at my day job at Lippman Kampfer Foundation for Living Torah. And what they created has had a transformational impact on our thinking and on our capacity to communicate what we're thinking. You can learn more about this work at delineateinc.com. Play Steinberg comes to this work as an accomplished poet, events manager, academic, and filmmaker, and after spending years immersed in the visual languages and landscapes of the American and Irish deaf communities. Play Steinberg holds an MA in Deaf Studies from Gallaudet University and a BA in Film and Media Studies and Women and Gender Studies from the University of Rochester. Our second guest, Sue Reinhold, in addition to leading Torah of Recovery, is the principal at Braveheart Advising, an executive coaching and spiritual advising practice. After a career that included founding and growing a noted wealth management firm, building a corporate strategy team at a Fortune 200 company, helping turn around a JCC and a large donor-advised philanthropy operation, Sue also helped start The Kitchen, a Jewish community that we met way back in episode 23. Now, in the mentoring and advising phase of her career, Sue Reinhold is a trusted advisor to C-level executives around the United States who are usually Jewish and who are running Jewish organizations. Sue has rabbinic ordination from Pluralistic Rabbinical Seminary, which we featured back in episode 175, and now she teaches select students as they prepare to convert to Judaism, including Play Steinberg. Play Steinberg, Sue Reinhold, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
It's great to be here.
Great to be here.
So, Play, we wanted to start with you because you're the sort of initiator of this conversation in the sense that your webcomic came out or is coming out. It's something that's being released monthly over time. And We are so fascinated by both the story that you're telling, but also by the process of there being such a thing as a Jewish webcomic and how that comes about. And so I wanted to start there and just ask you, how did this come about? How did you start on this project?
I heard actually, I think on Judaism Unbound or at Shavuot Live a couple of years ago about the Jewish Writers Initiative, the first year of the program that was focused on digital storytelling. They'd had a program for I don't know how many years around screenwriting, a screenwriters lab. And then just during COVID, they introduced a second cohort focusing on basically every digital media that is not long form filmic storytelling. The applications were due quite soon, I think, because it was Shavuot that I heard about it, and the deadline was sometime in the fall. And I thought, I'm not ready for this. I'm not sober enough. I'm not Jewish enough, but this is amazing. I'm going to bookmark it for next year. Fast forward a year later, when applications opened up again, I looked at it and I said, well, I haven't done most of these things. I haven't worked in social media episodic, series. I haven't done YouTube videos. I haven't done podcasting, but I am a scribe. I'm a visual storyteller. So I think I could tell a story in the form of a comic. So it was one of those. I'm actually the only person in the fellowship, I think, this year who pitched something that they'd never done before to say, here's this thing. I'm pretty sure I can do it. No, I never have. But I knew immediately that it would be an autobiographical story, making the decision that it would be released episodically to force me to actually produce it and release it and not let perfectionism get in the way of production. I ended up winning a place in that fellowship and so started working on the webcomic in January of 2024. I'm working on my conversion to Judaism right now. Sue is a rabbi that I'm working with, but I wasn't raised Jewish. I was born into a family with a Jewish dad and a Catholic mom, and mom made the decision about how the kids were being raised. So we were raised Catholic. We were only Jewish on the holidays, basically, when we were at our grandparents' house. So Hanukkah and Passover, we were Jewish, and that was sort of it. As a kid, I always felt like I would have made a better Jew, especially when I got older and I went off to college and I'd kind of had my falling out with the church as a result of coming out. I thought Judaism holds more for me, but I didn't see an inroad at all. I felt really intimidated by the idea of showing up at Hillel on campus, not really, quote unquote, being Jewish. And it wasn't until my early adulthood that I started piecemeal picking up these threads of Judaism and weaving them back into my life. So that's one of the themes that runs through this story that I'm trying to tell, reclaiming my Jewish inheritance ultimately. This is a spoiler, I guess, but it comes out very early in the story. I lost my father to suicide in 2016, and we were disinherited when that happened. And it took a number of years. This is actually in episode 5 or 6 that I talk about this, that I eventually realized that Judaism was actually my inheritance from my father. And that's what I can reclaim. And so that is the kind of the story that's driven on a personal level of what's brought me back to Judaism in such a direct way, that this is actually healing some deep intergenerational trauma to be able to reclaim this tradition and these practices as my own. There are other threads in the story that I'm telling that have to do with my interaction and time spent in other spiritual arenas and other religious faiths and how that intersects with this path of conversion now. I spent 17 years in a Tibetan Buddhist community, and that's actually something that I'm writing about currently in the next episode. And I spent a year in an evangelical Christian church. And then there's a theme around addiction and recovery, because that's part of my personal story as well as mental illness and recovery and living with mental illness.
So I met Play initially in person, right? Because we're having a digital conversation where we're on a couple of different continents of several different coasts. Someone's probably at least one of us is in the middle of the large country of the United States. And we met in an in-person weekend-long retreat around healing from divorce, which was featured on Judaism Unbound. And we bonded because we were both in recovery from addiction and had really sweet conversations about that. I had perhaps just launched or was in the process of launching my weekly Torah study, Torah of Recovery. And that's been going for 2 years now. And so Play became part of our, little online Zoom room where we meet once a week to discuss the weekly Torah portion. And all about getting more Torah in the world. And I built this little community to support my own recovery and to help people really find a new way to tell the story of who they are. It's one of the most challenging parts of recovery from addiction to a substance or a behavior, which is telling a different story about, like, who am I if I'm not this person who's doing this thing that really is harming me and other people in my life. I love that we're talking about storytelling, because whether we're doing digital storytelling, face-to-face storytelling, voice-to-voice storytelling, that's what we do as humans. And as a pretty, freshly minted rabbi and a passionate student of Torah, I'm always wanting to put Torah into the storytelling journeys that we take every day when we get up and get out of bed.
So there's a piece of this that I really want to note. I mean, you spoke about how you met at a shared longitude and latitude offline.
Mm-hmm.
And we're now here talking about digital Jewish creations. And I know, Sue, that you mentioned being a freshly minted rabbi. The seminary that you were ordained through is largely a digital organization. And so that's a through line we don't think about. I mean, so often offline organizations, synagogues, JCCs, like, I think they see digital programming as, we can create stuff online as like a gateway drug. I recognize that in a conversation where addiction is a theme, that's like a bizarre phrase to use. But like as a gateway into people actually coming to our building, people actually interacting in offline contexts. But what you've just identified is, in a very deep, powerful way, an offline retreat led to forms of creativity and art that are online. And I'm not saying that because it's better. I'm just saying it because I think that's a pathway we don't often talk about in Jewish life. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about that digital context. And maybe Play, we can start with you. Like, you could have made a zine that is on paper. Yes, it was this digital storytellers lab. So maybe part of the answer of why you did it digitally and not offline is because that's what the fellowship was. But why did you go in the direction of creating this digital context for Jewish exploration and learning, and not only the offline avenue?
In one part, yes, it was because of the Storytellers Lab specifically, that if I wanted to be a part of this cohort, the draw wasn't to me just the funding of the fellowship, but the being a part of a cohort of other Jewish creatives. There's another element to why I chose to do it digitally, which is that drawing a comic by hand I would draw it digitally even if I were putting it in print. That's the answer. When COVID began, my whole business world changed, because as a visual facilitator, I was making large maps of content for clients in person. So we were in entirely offline settings. And then with COVID, everything became an online Zoom room. And instead of scribing on a board that might be 4 by 8 feet, or a series of boards that are 4 by 8 feet in size, I'm scribing everything on a 14-inch screen on an iPad. That was a really difficult transition to make at the beginning of the pandemic. And I really rubbed against it for a long time, but eventually it became comfortable. And so this was an opportunity to make my own artwork in a medium that I'd made peace with and started to actually begin to enjoy. If I were to do a comic in print, I would still draw it digitally, but the difference is the layout. That's the huge difference, is that rather than being laid out in panels for pages, it's laid out in this vertical scroll that you ingest on your cell phone. So it's designed to be natively viewed on a mobile device. Again, at the beginning, I thought there's no way this could even work. How can I enjoy storytelling and story receiving on my phone? But then I read a few webcomics that I actually got into, and I found myself sitting on the couch reading the entire series without getting up for several hours, just like I were reading a book. And I realized, this is absolutely possible to tell stories in this way.
The powerful thing is we now have platforms and a choice about how we gather. And it's opened up this enormous aperture for, if you're not geographically in the same place, it's not as much of an issue that it used to be. So let's imagine even 5 years ago, if I had decided to organize in-person Torah of recovery session, it would be limited to people who could get near or close to Berkeley, California, at a particular time and on a particular day, the kind of the uptake and the flexibility, wouldn't be there. We've got people coming from all over the country. I think we've yet to see people coming from other continents at this point. And so to me, there's this incredible ability to curate a Jewish life. And for me, a life as a Jewish teacher and leader, balancing the right combination of in-person and digital formats. For me, a lot, my teaching and coaching is all face-to-face, but these days, I'd say 80 to 90% of it is happening on a Zoom screen or on the telephone. What COVID forced us into for a period of time would be, even me just living in Lisbon and having a whole bunch of clients and students in the United States would have been like, what are you talking about, Sue? That doesn't make any sense. It makes enough sense so that I can do it. And it's a little bit, I want to echo what Play said early in the conversation, which is, here's this thing, I've never done it, but I'm pretty sure I can.
So I want to come back, Play, to your conversion to Judaism, because there are people who say, Judaism is matrilineal, so if your mother wasn't Jewish, then you have to convert. But a lot of people don't see it that way and understand Judaism to be able to be passed along from either parent. And they would look at you and say, well, your father was Jewish, so you don't have to convert to Judaism. So I'm curious how you think about it in that way, like how you call it conversion and why you think about it that way, as opposed to just talking about it more as I'm here to re-embrace my Judaism, which I already am, or something along those lines.
One of the ways in which the idea of conversion first got put on the table, I think, in a conversation with Sue that took place in person. And I was expressing my discomfort and the problems that I was having in the evangelical church, which had a lot to do with my queerness, but was not limited to that. And she just kind of offhandedly said, well, I'll convert you if you want, but you don't have to. And it stuck in my head. And a few months later is when I reached out to her, concurrent with my application to the Jewish Writers Initiative, actually, and said, I want to make this real. And the reason that I consider it a conversion is because I feel like inheriting it by blood and not actually living any of it just isn't enough to say, oh, yeah, I'm Jewish. There's so much cultural knowledge and lived experience that I'm missing. I wanted this to be something with rigor, where I was actually engaging in study and experiential learning and filling in some of those gaps and skilling up in ways that, if you're Jewish, we're supposed to study forever. So it's not as though I'm done with my studies at the end of the year and then that's it. It's then, well, how and what am I going to study next? So it's actually teaching me how to study Jewishly, how to engage with text Jewishly, which aren't skills that I had before. And so if I just said, well, you know what, Dad was Jewish, I'm Jewish. Actually, as it turns out, I just recently found out that I have a great grandfather on my mother's side who was also Jewish. So, there's sort of the over 50% mark now in the family story, which is wild. But I still don't feel like that just gives me carte blanche to say, okay, I'm Jewish, end of story, because it would leave me hanging. It would leave me not knowing what to do next with that. And going through a conversion process, doing the kind of study that Sue and I have done, in a way, I think she's got me basically reading all the texts that she read in rabbinical school. So not every single one, right? But a fair number of them.
A couple of them.
I change with every book that I'm reading. And that's not something that would happen if I just on my own said, you know what, I'm Jewish.
Yeah, so Sue, I'm curious how your take, in this conversation, but when you were talking to Play at that time at the camp and you said, hey, I'll convert you, I'm curious like why you didn't just say, hey, you're already Jewish, so let's study together or something like that. I'm interested in that moment, but I'm more profoundly interested in your take on conversion as somebody who has converted yourself to Judaism and become a rabbi. And I'm wondering if you have a take on conversion that plays into all this, no pun intended.
Look, if it wasn't intended, it was still delightful, and I think it should retroactively come with some intent.
Okay, retroactively intended. Because I, as we've discussed many times on this podcast, have a radical set of ideas about conversion, but I actually have come to understand it as a radical set of ideas about being Jewish. And I'm kind of wondering whether, whatever we end up calling it, every Jew should basically be doing what Play is doing. In other words, that it's really, you're talking about I think, a great way to be a Jew, whether we call it conversion or not. So I don't know, lay it on us, Sue. What are your thoughts?
I love that. And that's a little bit about where my come from place was when I said to Play, hey, I'll convert you, because here was a person who is saying to me, mind you, a person named Steinberg, right? So a person
Right,
named
exactly.
Steinberg saying to me, I don't feel like a Jew. I don't think I'm a Jew. And so my immediate response was like, let's do what we need to do so that you think you're a Jew and you feel like a Jew, which is, guess what? Go study. Play and I have a little bit similar backgrounds because I had two Jewish grandfathers, grandfather on my mom's side, grandfather on my dad's side, who were both born of Jewish women, but were not raised Jewish. And I was raised Catholic as well. So I went through my whole life with people saying, you're Jewish, right? And actually, my answer to what religion I was, no, I'm Catholic, because I was asked so frequently, it was assumed so frequently that I was a Jew. Going through a profound process of studying for conversion, you do hit, it's not rabbinic school, but you hit the highlights, right? You do some Jewish history and you think about God and you read about God and talk about prayer and what is prayer and et cetera, et cetera. So, and there are wonderful, Judaism 101 classes all over the country. And in this particular instance, I said, Play, hey, go take a Judaism 101 class. And Player's like, no, I want to study with you. And I was like, okay, that sounds fun. I think you're right, Dan, that this is just what's a good idea for every person who can, who's a Jew to do, which is to sit down in a virtual room or in an actual room face to face, curate it so that you've got a good balance that feels right to you, and study together. And for me, it's less a process of there's something called conversion where there's this magic day where a switch is flipped, then you're stepping into and assuming this full, robust, wonderful identity that offers you the opportunity for a lifetime of engagement and meaning making. I sit with the reality that there are so many people who have told me, I'm not a good Jew. I want to be a better Jew. I wish I were a better Jew. I don't know enough. And I don't know if anybody's done the survey, but 8 out of 10 Jews in America feel like they're not a good enough Jew. There's got to be some statistic out there like that. And so I'm a lot less worried. And this may, I don't know if this puts me in the category of radical about who is a Jew and who is not a Jew, as opposed to who wants to study Jewish things and do Jewish things in community. Then get on in the room. I'm not sure I'm going to quote my Rabbi Noah Kushner in San Francisco, the founding rabbi of the Kitchen, where she says, look, you could be Moses, but if you don't want to do Jewish things in here with us, I'm not sure what you're doing here. And you could be Santa Claus. And if you want to do Jewish things with us, come on, let's go.
Santa Claus did tell me once, I've said this on the podcast before, Santa Claus did tell me once that he was Jewish. When I was about 5 years old, Santa Claus at the store called me over because I was a young kid and was like, yeah, and he was being kind of aggressive. And I was like, no. And finally, I walked up to him and I said, I'm Jewish. And he pulls me in and whispers really softly, me too. And that was, I was not a particularly helpful friend to my Christian brethren the next few weeks who I was telling Santa Claus is Jewish to. But
that's great.
Always a fun story.
That's great. And I don't think it's an extreme position, because I also think it's a really, really beautiful thing to embrace and adopt a Jewish identity.
I'm inspired by both of you very deeply because you both went through conversion journeys. And like Dan said, we could have long conversations about whether it was conversion, affirmation, how we think about this with both of your respective familial heritages. But you went through journeys to Judaism. And I am always unbelievably impressed and inspired by people who they convert. And then the next step is, I immediately am going to create Jewish art. I am going to eventually become a rabbi, a teacher of Jews. There are many folks who feel like I need to tiptoe a little bit. I'm new to this. I haven't been full-fledged as a Jew. And so my role is to be along for the ride and be a supporter, but not necessarily yet to be a producer of Judaism or a changer of Judaism or a teacher of Judaism. And so I'd love to hear about that that next step? Because like we certainly hear from folks with a kind of Jewish imposter syndrome who are like, it's not that they don't feel like their conversion happened or their journey to Judaism happened, but they feel like, okay, yeah, I'm a Jew, but I'm not part of the club or category of people where I feel like I can be a Jewish agitator or be like a Jewish teacher or be a Jewish artist. So I'm curious how y'all were able to become those kinds of things.
Agitator, teacher, and artist are all things that I was anyway. So doing them Jewishly is just doing them in a coherent fashion with the person that I'm becoming. I wouldn't say I'm a Jewish teacher, at this point, or that I'm going to become one. People joke around and tell me that I'm definitely going to be a rabbi, and I don't know if that's true. I mean, and it's not something that I'm not online at night looking at rabbinical schools trying to game out, my next steps.
But you're saying there's a chance.
But it could happen,
And by the way, it's like we should flag that it's a little sad how much people do that with anybody who does deep Jewish learning. Like Dan has talked about this because people say that to him. Like it's kind of a bummer that we assume anybody who's like really revved up about doing Jewish art or teaching or whatever, like, oh, obviously they're going to be a rabbi. It implies that there's not other ways to be revved up about that.
Yeah, or that study isn't just inherent to the Jewish experience anyway. So you don't have to be a rabbi to study Judaism your entire life. I mean, as for the arts part, I don't know what I'm doing next after this comic. I know that I want something to happen. I want it to take a different shape. I'd love to see it come into 3 dimensions somehow. And so something will continue. And so there will be more Jewish art, I suppose, is what I'm saying, even though I don't know what it will look like.
I appreciate this question. I'm a lifelong entrepreneur. I'm a serial entrepreneur. I spent my whole career kind of building stuff and building organizations, fixing organizations, and also just like putting in my time, studying, being in community, building community, and looking around. And I think people build the things that they need. So I'm looking around and I'm like, okay, well, boy, it would sure be great to go study Torah in a small group every week with a whole bunch of people who are in recovery. Oh, maybe I should do that. Right now, I'm getting inquiries here in Lisbon, Portugal, where I'm spending a lot of time, where there are a lot of recent arrivals from Brazil, Jewish arrivals from Brazil, the United States, and even to a certain extent Israel, where they're saying like, we're all in Lisbon and we don't have a place to go to like do Jewish stuff. Like, what are we going to do? And they're like, hey, would you do some Jewish stuff? And I'm like, well, I need some Jewish stuff, right? Because they on the ground Jewish community here. Long story, but the ecosystem doesn't feel like super welcoming to the types of arrivals that Lisbon's has gotten in the last 5-10 years. So, okay, well, I need that. So maybe I'll do that. So it's really, again, to come back to this, like, here's this thing. I've never done it. I'm pretty sure I can. And maybe some other people will want to do it with me.
I'm hearing in this the possibility of an appendix to this idea that we developed early on in the history of Judaism Unbound, which we called the chutzpah versus knowledge curve, which is a U-shaped curve. And the idea was that in general, as people learn more about Judaism, their chutzpah decreases because they're kind of told Judaism has to be a certain way. And then when they learn a lot, their chutzpah starts to go up again because what they realize is that all those stories were BS and, Judaism was never one way and et cetera, et cetera. And then but the problem is that I think a lot of people stop learning before they get to the upswing on the chutzpah versus knowledge curve. And one of the big questions that we've had on Judaism Unbound all these years is, can we do something about that, whether we've said it explicitly or implicitly? And I think that, in a sense, like our idea about the Yeshiva was like, could we do Jewish learning of our own in a style that doesn't ever suppress your chutzpah, that always tells you, chutzpah is good, keep it up, keep it up, keep it up. And we've tried to do that. But I feel like you're introducing another sort of appendix to the chutzpah versus knowledge curve, which is that there's certain people who have so much chutzpah, or have so much of a something that's so inherent to who they are that they will not be suppressed.
Look, the book that Play and I are reading together right now is Rabbi Ed Feinstein's The Chutzpah Imperative. It's a book basically that, one of the key through lines through all of Judaism is basically chutzpah. I mean, here's this guy, he like his dad had traveled from like Ur, to Haran, and his name's Avram. Of course, I'm talking about our first patriarch, Abraham. who's just like, yeah, I'm going to just follow this God that I talked to, and we're going to like go over there somewhere. And I'm not sure where it is. And, we're just going to like try this whole new thing that is, turned out to be what we got in this like beautiful religion of ours. So I think it's a good idea to encourage chutzpah. And there's also a little bit of like magic fairy dust in this. Like Play and I met, it was happenstance, the Play and I met, and some pretty cool things are coming out of it.
So I'd love to jump back into, we've talked about comics a number of times on this podcast, actually. I think that it's a really important medium because comics they blend together, I don't know, some adjectives. Beautiful. They can be very visually appealing, which like when you read a book, okay, the cover art can be beautiful. Like the text even could be beautiful, but I think it's less meant to come to life in that way. It also is approachable. And like when people talk about comics, it's generally seen, and I don't always love this, but not as like high art, which can be a feature, not a bug. It can actually mean that like a greater population of people are ready to dive into something than if you told them like, oh, Play created some fascinating long form work of nonfiction about Jewishness, about conversion, about recovery, about all those things. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts, Play, on the power of comics. How might that medium have really specific kinds of power?
One answer is you could read Scott McCloud's books on comics if you want to know kind of just pragmatically how do comics work, what makes them work, how do they function, how does story get told in linear, nonlinear boxes, and what happens between the panels and all of that. I grew up reading a couple comics that were sort of in the environmental sciences genre, educational comics that my mother would have picked out for me to read. And I never got into comic books per se. And I took the very snobbish route of just looking down on the medium entirely for a really long time because I didn't know that there was more to it than Marvel and the kind of the mainstream comic genres. But now the genre has really blossomed, and graphic novels, which are long form stories told in this visual format, there are hundreds and thousands of them now, and it's becoming more recognized as a legitimate literary format. I think Alison Bechdel's work is a perfect example of that. Her book Fun Home and the follow-up book Are You My Mother, which are autobiographical stories, they're memoirs, and they're highly literary. They're filled with references to Faust and to psychoanalysis and all of these things that you wouldn't necessarily expect to find in a comic. And it's not that the reader has to get all those references to get the comic, because there are pictures as well. So you can follow a story through the words, you can follow a story through the pictures, you can follow a story through the interplay of both. One of the great strengths that I see in the medium in the way that I'm using it for this, for Father, Mother, God, is that it's forcing me to be succinct about things that I could write about forever if I were just writing. And I might write about them for so long that nobody would want to read it, which is not useful. But when I'm trying to boil down some really complex idea or experience or insight into almost the form of a poem that I can draw pictures to, then suddenly it has all this potency, and it can appeal to people who, like I was, don't consider themselves readers or consumers of comics. And they can go, oh, you know what? I never thought of myself as a comics person, but this is really doing something for me here.
Sometimes in Father, Mother, God, you portray yourself in a very kind of photorealistic almost way where you really, I mean, I know you, I can recognize you. And sometimes it's a much different way that's much more like it's not recognizable as you, but it's you. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that and about, in a way, like whether that represents things that can be done in the comic genre versus in other kinds of storytelling genres. And I'm also wondering about what you described earlier, the way that the comic scrolls. And I hope people can understand that from just us talking about it, but maybe that's also an excuse that you really should run and read this for all kinds of reasons. But including among those is understanding how this works and how you just kind of keep scrolling and scrolling, and it's not like different panels like you would imagine in a comic book. I mean, there's a little bit of that, but often it just feels like the whole story is just scrolling up the screen. And I'm curious if you could talk about the experience of storytelling that way and how it affects the story.
To the first question, part of the reason that sometimes I draw myself really photorealistically and sometimes I don't is that I'm not a comics artist by trade. So if I wanted to draw myself, recognizably myself every single time, it would bog me down. It would just, I don't have that muscle memory yet to be able to produce a sketch that looks like me every time, even if it's a much simpler sketch. I just said, you know what? I'm not going to bother with that. I'm going to have crazy hair on top of my head, and the rest of me is not going to look like a human at all necessarily. And that's going to be enough, because what I'm trying to convey is a feeling more than a perfect picture of myself. And in the points where it is more photorealistic of me, it's because I think there's more emotion in those images that I'm trying to really say, here's me in real life, to land a certain beat in the storyline. In terms of the scrolling, I mean, that was one of the biggest shifts that I had to make in my own brain to begin working in webcomics, coming from graphic facilitation, because I was used to working on this horizontal pane. And to suddenly have this narrow window that could go down forever, it was a really hard adjustment to make. I don't know if I can tell a story up and down. I only know how to tell a story laterally. But what I discovered, I think, in just how I began the story, I didn't know where to begin or how to do it. So I literally started in the beginning. The first episode is called Bereshit, those are the first words of Genesis. It's literally in the beginning. So from there, it just started with darkness and void, and then, water, and then light. And it flowed in this way where I didn't have to draw separate panes. And I realized I don't really want to draw separate panes. I want there to be this sense of flow, that it almost feels animated to read because you're constantly moving. One of the features that creates is that you never necessarily, for those longer stretches, you don't necessarily ever see the whole picture at once. It's impossible because it stretches longer than the screen of your mobile device. I can see the pictures in full because I'm drawing them, and I draw them in much taller panels than one screen at a time. I draw them in panels where I can see the equivalent of 6 phone screens at a time. And that's part of the reason that I want to try and find another way to bring this to life, so that I can share what it looks like in those forms where you can actually see. In the first episode, there's a picture of me holding a photograph of my father's grocery store. And you scroll down, it's very, very close up of my hair and my glasses and my nose and my lips, and then my hand and the photo, but you can't see it all at once. So there's this element of playing with what's hidden and what's revealed that comes with this format of scrolling.
If I can jump in, I love what Play's saying about this, because there's a stricture of a form that's creating an opportunity. And this is happening in digital spaces everywhere we look. And I think, especially with regard to visual representation, it's worth noting we're moving back to the future in a particular kind of way. One of my favorite authors is the late, great Leonard Shlain, who was a neurologist. I think he was a brain surgeon. And
the father of previous guest Tiffany Shlain.
Right, the father of Tiffany Shlain. When I met Tiffany, I'm like, oh, I love your dad. I mean, I think I know a little bit about you, but I really love your dad.
I try to say that to everybody I meet.
He made this statement in this book called The Alphabet versus the Goddess, that society transitioned around the same time that society transitioned to using alphabets as opposed to visual images. Society transitioned from gods that you could see and touch and even have on a shelf in your home to a monotheistic God, who is this God that was everywhere and nowhere, invisible and eternal. And so we're in a really big transition. And I think, what Leonard Shlain said about this was we're moving back towards visual representation, away from all the kind of left brain rationalist thinking. He even said it would move us away from the kind of patriarchy that we've had, And I love, and to bring this back to Play's comic, I love that Play's comic is called Father, Mother, God, which is kind of everything.
So a topic that came up earlier in our conversation was the whole way that recovery fits into your story, Play, your story, Sue, your story together. And Sue, I would be remiss to not take a little bit of time to hear a little bit about what you've been doing in terms of the Torah of Recovery, but also in terms of the way that spirituality connects with recovery. I think a lot of us know about AA, maybe experienced AA, or maybe just read about it and don't really know that much. But I think that there's an understanding that spirituality has been really important for people in their recovery. But I'm curious, like, we don't hear a lot about Judaism in that space. And I'm curious how you think about it. Like, is it that spiritual traditions of all kinds can be significant in recovery? And I'm curious why, or do you think that there are specific Jewish approaches to recovery or Jewish material that helps in different ways, just as any spiritual tradition helps different people in different ways?
Thanks, Dan. Look, addiction at its core, I believe, is a spiritual malaise. And I'm quoting Rabbi Mark Borovitz, who is the founding rabbi at the landmark Addiction Recovery and Treatment Center in LA, which is Jewish, called Beit Teshuvah, the House of Return. So any religious or spiritual tradition can hold a person through the journey of recovery. You know, I'm an active participant in 12-step. I find it to be incredibly useful. It's all over the world. You can find a meeting anywhere. And it is, in its own way, its own kind of spiritual, its own kind of very deep and profound and long-lasting spiritual tradition. I've also found that the 12 steps of either, AA or, all the anonymous, right? There's for behaviors and all kinds of substances, or all kinds of them, to be not specifically Christian, but the underlying premise is pretty Christian, which is there is a God, and that God is interested in your personal salvation. Profound respect for Christianity, but I don't have conversations about personal salvation in Jewish circles. Our Jewish God is a little different, and our Jewish God has a different history. Our Jewish God has a different expression in history, and so AA is great. And I found a need, and again, kind of building the things you need to be in a space that is Jewish. And for me, because I'm a text nerd, text focused, text rich, where we can have Jewish conversations about recovery, support each other in recovery, without this kind of supposition that there's a God who is principally interested in our personal salvation. I built something that I needed, and in supporting my own recovery, I'm also able to help support other people's recovery. So we meet every week. It's on Zoom. Very low barriers to participation. You don't have to know anything about the Torah or Hebrew.
In my experience participating in Torah of Recovery for the last almost 2 years, I think, it's been some of the most profound Torah study that I've done because of this lens of recovery that's brought to it. So instead of being this completely open-ended, okay, what does this parsha mean? What is this about? What's happening this week? And what does it have to do with me? It's through this specific lens of recovery, which means we can have conversations about, are the characters having emotional relapses? Is God having a relapse? What's actually happening in a way that I can take it into my recovery and better understand my own process of healing through this text. And so it makes the Torah much more personal to me than it was before.
I think that's such an important general teaching about how we do Torah learning or Torah study. We need to think more about what goggles we're wearing as we look at the Torah, or I don't know, what filters we have on, to use like an Instagram language, and I don't even just mean it on Instagram. I mean, like, what is coloring, quote unquote, our ways of reading the text. I think it's actually really hard to just have a group of people, like you said, here's the Torah portion, go. What do you think? Like, I've led many Torah studies, and when you don't give a little bit more of some goggles, like a lens, it's hard. So I love that you have found that particular space, that both of you have found that particular space of the lens being recovery. I think we should really think seriously about that generally, because the generalist Torah study that we do does not always land on people. You're doing such an important thing. And just to really shout out, like we've mentioned this a couple times before, like there's this notion that Jews somehow need this less, like there's fewer Jews that have addiction issues. Like this notion, it's not articulated directly very much, but it floats around and it's really toxic and unhelpful. So
I understand that as a pretty tiny minority in diaspora in a society that, where we're just a really little people, we want to put the best face on our community possible. And I do think that's led to a lot of denial in the Jewish community about the fact that there is addiction in the Jewish community, and Jews need help with this as much as any other group.
Absolutely. So the closing question I have is one that I love asking on this podcast, and it is directed mostly to Play, but I'd love to hear your thoughts too, Sue. Like the name of this webcomic, Father, Mother, God. There's a period between father, it's like father, period, mother, period, God, period. I think there's the period after God too. Because your literal father plays a role in the story, I figure like some of this might be hinting at relationships to parents in a human sense, but also to God as a kind of father or mother figure. But like, maybe I'm totally wrong. So Play, can you help me understand as we close what that title is conveying, why you chose it?
Well, you're on the right track, Lex. Absolutely. It does refer to my parents, and it also refers to God as a parent. I'm wrestling with my father and the inheritance from my father, not only of Judaism, but of suicide and mental illness. And I'm wrestling with my mother and the inheritance of my mother of her suicide and mental illness. And then there's God, who's been this theme throughout. Where do I land spiritually? Who am I turning to? What path am I taking? And is God a parental figure or something else entirely? In my time as a Buddhist, there's this phrase that about your teacher or the Buddha, your ultimate nature, being even more precious to you than your parents, because they can give you what your parents couldn't give you. So there's that flavor as well, of father, mother as questions or problems and God as answer. So Father, Mother, God encapsulates everything. It's 3 sentences, but it's actually 1 sentence. And I felt like that just tells the whole story.
Thank you so much, Play and Sue, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lex. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Play.
Love when our guests thank our other guests. Thanks to both of you, and thanks also to all of you out there listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. A reminder, Dan mentioned it at the top, but we want to mention it again. The Onion Yeshiva, our digital center for Jewish learning and unlearning, has a bunch of amazing classes coming your way. There are 4 mini course options that are each 3 sessions, 1 per week, so 3 weeks long. There is also our semester-long Judaism Inbound class with our executive director, Miriam Turlinchamp. You can learn about all of these at judaismunbound.com/classes. We've got an amazing slate of teachers, all of whom are past guests on Judaism Unbound, or me. So check those out. And as we close, we want to encourage you to be in touch with us because we love hearing your questions, your thoughts, your ideas based on all these conversations. So here are all the ways you can do that. First, there's our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram feeds. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, there's our email addresses, dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. Third, you can head to our website, judaismunbound.com, check out our show notes for this episode and all sorts of other good resources. We've got Elul Unbound kicking off for the month leading into the high holidays, Shabbat Unbound, our 12-month-long Shabbat service, all sorts of other goodies. And we're deeply appreciative if you're able to support us financially to keep all this work going, which you can do via judaismunbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or via a one-time gift. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.